Friday. It's 11 o'clock. It's actually later than 11 o'clock, but it's time for research with Dr. Jonathan Tarbox. I always say I love this time of the week. It's the perfect end for the week to have you come in.
Thank you.
And explain things to us.
I always have a good time, too.
And sometimes we talk about things that are not fun, and that's pretty much what today is, but I always feel better after I've talked to you. One of the things that I asked Dr. Tarbox to come in and talk with us about, because it's been in the news so much in the last 6 months, this whole idea of scream rooms, that some schools are having them and people call them different things, but we've seen in the last 6 months the padded rooms that people are sticking kids in, the plywood boxes, the cardboard boxes, the duffel bags. It's this running theme of let's get the child removed so we don't have to deal with the behavior. And it's, you and I were talking about it, and it's like a timeout on steroids, I guess. This whole idea of putting the kids someplace else. And so I kind of wanted to know from a research perspective how effective the idea of a timeout is, and this whole idea of people not understanding and feeling like they need to restrain a child. If you could enlighten us in terms of your experience and research, that's a lot. That's, it's like, go. What can you tell us?
All right, well, yeah, there's a lot to deal with, but first, actually, let's start by clarifying some terminology.
Okay.
Because it's always tricky to know exactly what we're talking about, and I'm sure, as you're saying, different school districts and different parents and different teachers are using different terms. Let me say off the bat, I'm not an expert in scream rooms. I'm not sure exactly where that term came from. I guess the idea is let the kid kind of scream it out and kind of get out express their aggression or something like that in a way that doesn't hurt anyone.
Including that.
So let's just define some terms that are real terms. One is seclusionary timeout.
Okay.
And that's where you place someone in a separate area. It's timeout from positive reinforcement. So you take them out of their normal environment, which should be full of positive reinforcement, and you seclude. Right, should be, and you seclude them in a separate area against their will, generally, and that can be done as a consequence for behavior, in which case it's a punishment procedure if it actually works, or it can be done as an emergency intervention. So that's another distinction that's kind of important to make too. A punishment procedure or an intervention therapeutic procedure versus an emergency procedure. Something that you're doing temporarily that is not intended to actually help the behavior or help the individual in any way, but is simply done as an emergency procedure to prevent injury is usually referred to as an emergency intervention or emergency procedure. So that's something where the goal is not to actually make the problem behavior decrease. The goal is not to increase some other alternative behavior. The goal is not to help the person in any way. It's simply to prevent destruction from happening in the moment. So prevent the individual from hurting themselves or from hurting someone else or engaging in property destruction that's so large that it could result in injury.
See, I can already see why we have a problem because I can see where people are confusing the two.
Oh, absolutely. Already. It's very common to confuse the two. And frankly, every state that you're in has different regulations regarding the difference between these two procedures or two types of procedures. And even within each state, oftentimes each school district or each county will have its own regulations. And even within different ABA agencies, they have different ways of doing things. So it is extremely confusing. But the distinction is somewhat important because when you're doing something therapeutically, it needs to be something that's ethically justified. It needs to be something that has research support. And it needs to be something that's likely to work, that you have some reason to believe is actually going to help the person, right? It's going to decrease their challenging behavior and increase an alternative behavior. And if we're talking about problem behavior, we should be talking about the function of the behavior, right? So if it's a therapeutic intervention or part of the BIP, it needs to be something that addresses the function of the behavior and therefore will decrease the challenging behavior because it actually deals with the function of the behavior. So let's talk about some functions that timeout could be good or bad for.
Okay.
And as I know your viewers are probably experts by now on the different functions of behavior.
Well, people, this might be their first time watching, so we start at the beginning.
So to quickly review, attention is a real common function of behavior, and that means the child is engaging in the problem behavior in order to get other people's attention. Okay. And not always positive attention. In fact, usually it's negative attention. So basically, the kid is trying to get a rise out of you. The kid is trying to get you to reprimand reprimand him, is essentially what it comes down to.
Right.
Then there's escape as a function of behavior, which means the child doesn't want to do what you're asking him to do, and so he's engaging in the challenging behavior to try to get out of having to do it. So if you ask me to do my homework and I throw my homework and then you give me a break because you see I'm frustrated, then you're basically giving me escape from the homework. And so that could actually be one of the reasons why I'm doing the behavior. Tangible is another function, and that's where an individual is trying to get access to something they want. It could be a preferred toy, activity, food, things like that. So the classic example is the kid in the grocery store crying in the candy aisle until mom gives him the candy bar, then the kid stops crying, right? So the function there is to get the candy bar. And then automatic reinforcement is where the behavior produces its own source of reinforcement. So it basically produces its own pleasure. So it's like a habit, a lot of self-stimulatory behaviors like that.
I'm going to have you pause there. We're going to take a short break, and then we're going to come back and talk about how we plug that into things to see how we can create an intervention to change some of those things.
Sounds good.
So stick with us, back in just a minute. Welcome back to Autism Live. It's Friday, so we have Dr. Jonathan Tarbox with us. He's the head of research and development here at the Center for Autism and Related Disorders. Always a thrill to have you here.
Thank you.
We're talking about timeouts, and I just want to recap a little bit because we were talking about two different things: emergency procedures for a timeout, and then the other one, seclusionary.
Well, the distinction is between procedures that are done just as an emergency measure, not to actually help the behavior in any way, but just to keep people safe, versus treatment procedures or therapeutic procedures that are part of the BIP, part of the individual's behavior intervention plan. The purpose of those procedures is to decrease the challenging behavior and replace it with more adaptive behavior.
But before we can do that, we have to know the function of the behavior, and you were just going through the four main...
Sort of the classic ones, yeah. So attention...
The usual suspects, I like to call them.
You go there first, because something like 90-something% of problem behavior displayed by individuals with developmental disabilities actually fits in one of those four categories. So it's always good to try those first.
And the four again?
Attention, escape, tangible, and automatic reinforcement, or self-stimulatory.
So we're usually looking for one of those, and once we know the function of the behavior, why they're engaging in this behavior, what are we going to do with that?
Okay, well, what you always want to do is start with positive reinforcement-based interventions first. So you never want to go straight to something like timeout. You never want to go straight to a punishment procedure. And there's a couple reasons for that. Number one, it's just not ethical anymore. So all of the ethical guidelines that, the teachers, educators, psychologists, behavior analysts, all of our ethical guidelines say that it's your professional duty to try the positive reinforcement-based, least intrusive interventions first. So that's not even a choice.
I got to stop you there, because that's a really important thing for our parents and our teachers to know. So if it's all about ethics, right? It all becomes legal at that point. So if somebody is doing this, putting your child in a timeout kind of a situation, they need to be able to document for you that they tried all these other things first, or you can say to them, this is ethically incorrect.
That's exactly right. And they should be able to provide graphs, literally graphs of data showing this is the rate of your child's challenging behavior over time. And here is several different positive reinforcement-based interventions that we've tried first. And look, here, we did them correctly. We made sure everyone is trained properly, and they still didn't work. And now at this point, we feel it's appropriate to do at least a brief trial of something more intrusive, like a timeout, if they want to do it, if that's appropriate. But yeah, then you never just jump straight to that.
Okay, really important for us to know. So, but if they have tried those things, then and they should really be getting the parents' approval, though, to be doing this kind of...
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And that's one thing that we see, unfortunately, all the time in shall we say, educational circumstances where there isn't sufficient training for the professionals. We see people kind of just making up their own treatments. So it could be a teacher's aide, or it could be a teacher just kind of improvising their own behavior intervention plan without going through any of the proper processes for determining what's really appropriate and what's research-based and what's safe and ethical. And so we'll see folks just kind of improvise some kind of restraint or improvise some kind of timeout, and it's really scary. Unfortunately, really common. But yeah, so let's say, let's say you have gotten to the point where you think that some kind of consequence-based procedure to decrease the behavior, which really in terms of behavioral principles, that's called punishment, some kind of punishment procedure is justified, then you really need to consider function. And so let's talk about function and timeout. Let's say the function of your challenging behavior is to get out of having to do work. And so you say the F word, or you tear up your worksheet, or you hit another kid, and the teacher sends you to a timeout room, and you get to hang out in the timeout room for 20 minutes while you scream it out, supposedly.
Right.
Well, if you just got away from work for 20 minutes, and that was the reason why you were doing the behavior to begin with, was to get away from work, you're reinforcing the behavior.
And you're just going to see more of that behavior. We're going to go in the opposite direction of where we want to go.
That's right.
So not effective.
No, it's
certainly not efficient.
Right, and it flies in the face of sort of normal common sense, because what you might say is, well, that doesn't make sense. The kid doesn't want to be in the timeout room. Well, of course he doesn't want to be in the timeout room, but it might still be better than the work that he's being made to do.
Right. If I could go to a scream room as opposed to doing my taxes, I'd be happy to go to the scream room. There we have it, right?
That's a perfect example.
Right?
Right. And
the lesser of two evils. I'll go to the scream room, take me there.
That's
Take me now.
Take me now. And unfortunately, academic work for a lot of kids on the spectrum is kind of like you or I doing our taxes, if it isn't customized and modified appropriately.
Right.
So there's lots of ways that you can make work fun, and I don't know that we have time to go into that today, but there are a lot of things you can do to make work fun. So academic work shouldn't just be a drag. It shouldn't be taxes, but many times it is. And if that's the case, then you can bet that your child that you're working with may well want to get into that timeout room to escape the work.
Right.
So determine function first. If it's escape, don't try timeout. You got to try everything else first, like teaching other ways that the child can get escape, right? Teaching him to ask for a break, teaching him to ask for help, or when he completes a small amount of work, give him a break, etc. But let's talk about some other functions. What if the function is attention? Then a timeout might be more effective. Again, it completely just depends on the child and the circumstances. But if timeout is done correctly, then the child's not getting attention while they're in timeout.
Or on the way to, this is one of the things where I have an issue. If the scream room is across the campus and this child is having to be taken kicking and screaming to the scream room and it's attention driven, then we just gave it a bunch of attention.
That's exactly right. And one thing I see all the time is folks don't realize that just because you have to interact with a person doesn't mean you have to give them a ton of attention. So let's say you are transitioning a kid to another classroom or to a timeout room or a scream room or whatever you want to call it. You don't need to make eye contact with them. You don't need to talk to them. You don't need to lecture them. You don't need to explain in 50 ways how frustrated you are with them, or why don't they listen, or why are they doing this, right? You can do it neutrally without eye contact and without talking at all. And so just that reduces the overall amount of attention that the person's getting as a consequence for the behavior. So that can be helpful if it is attention maintained.
Okay. So that's escape and attention. What about if it's for a tangible?
It depends. You better make sure they're not getting that tangible item in the timeout room. It doesn't really address the function at all. Like, timeout for escape, it addresses the function, but in the opposite way. It's the opposite of what you should do. Timeout for attention addresses the function, and if it's done right, at least is addressing it in the right way by not giving the person attention. Timeout for tangibly maintained behavior is just kind of irrelevant to the function. So again, it really should be the last thing you should do is go towards something like that.
And I would think for things that are self-reinforcing, if they're given time in the timeout room, they're going to have more access to be able to do whatever it is that was reinforcing.
Well, that's a good point. So for automatically reinforcing behaviors or self-stimulatory behaviors, if they're able to do the behavior freely in the timeout room, then that's probably not going to be a very effective punishment, because you're giving them exactly what they want, more time to do the behavior.
So what I'm hearing is that the only possible place where a timeout could even potentially have purposeful meaning and be effective is when it's attention, and it has to be done correctly. And as a former teacher who dealt with challenging kids, attention is the one function that's the easiest one to address, because if you just give attention on a consistent basis, usually, almost always, you can turn things around.
Well, and there's a decent amount of research to show that by teachers simply giving lots of high quality, positive regard to students when they're not engaging in challenging behavior, and you can either just do it any old time when they're not engaging in challenging behavior, which would be kind of a DRO or maybe even non-contingent reinforcement, or you can pick particular alternative behaviors that you want to praise and that you want to reward, and so you give lots of high-quality, positive regard every time the student raises his hand, or every time the student, turns in their work, or every time the student sits quietly, or whatever the behavior is that you're reinforcing. There's lots of research to show that works, and a great saying that floats around in the ABA community is, Praise is free. Doesn't cost you a thing to just be nice to someone.
Yeah, and attention is too. And people think that it requires so much attention, and literally attention from them, that they're watching the clock and saying, okay, I'm going to make sure that I'm going to give attention, and it takes so much energy. But the truth of the matter is, giving attention on a regular, consistent basis requires a great deal more energy than dealing with challenging behavior. Whether
Great deal less.
Oh yes, excuse me. It's a lot easier.
Way
Thank you. Yeah, it's way easier to give attention than having to escort someone to a scream room.
Yeah, and I think when people object to procedures like that, like, oh, that's going to be too difficult, it's going to be too much effort, they're forgetting that if it works, it's not that effortful. It's easier because they're probably picturing, oh, I have to deal with a huge tantrum and be nice constantly at the same time or something like that. That's not the point. Is if you're doing the procedure and it works, you're going to deal with less challenging behavior.
Absolutely. Okay. So not a lot of reason to be using a timeout to begin with.
Right, at all. Like timeout
even if you're
really
doing it properly.
Yeah, even if you're doing it the right way, it should really be one of the last resorts. There's really very few circumstances, except in the case of really extreme behaviors, when timeout is necessary, especially in the school setting. You know, you watch Super Nanny, and she basically uses timeout as punishment for pretty much anything that a kid does in terms of misbehavior, and it does generally work in the home setting if you do it right, and you know, everything like that. But in the school setting, it's very, 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 very rare that you really need to use timeout. It almost always can be addressed successfully without it.
Okay, so that's when it is therapeutic in nature.
Right.
But here we have these other circumstances, because I'm guessing that some of the schools are saying that, oh, this was an emergency procedure.
Right, yeah.
So if somebody's doing an emergency procedure, and we've said it's not serving a purpose in terms of therapy, but we're just trying to make sure that everybody's safe for a period of time, then clearly that can't be an intervention.
Right, yeah, I mean, by definition, that's not an intervention. It's just a Band-Aid for the moment, you know. You know, you better track very carefully how often you're implementing the emergency procedure, and you better track, is it having an effect on the behavior? Because even if you don't intend it to be an intervention, it is a consequence for the behavior, and so you may well be reinforcing the behavior. So the team needs to track how often it's being done. Is there a change in the rate of behavior over time before versus after you started the emergency intervention? And of course, naturally, they're already probably tracking injuries, you know, how often is someone getting injured, and, you know, things like that. And of course, that should be low to non-existent. So yeah, it's tricky. And again, that should be a bit of a red flag. I mean, an emergency intervention is no substitute for a good BIP.
Right.
Basically, it's a red flag saying your BIP doesn't work. You know?
And that maybe people aren't correctly following the BIP.
That's right.
Also.
That's a very good point.
And it just concerns me because more and more we get people who are writing in and saying, you know, my child's about to get kicked out of school. They've been suspended 5 times.
Right.
You know, we're talking about a 4th and 5th grader on the spectrum being sent home from school because the school is saying they can't deal with it. And in the news, we're hearing about these kids being put in the duffel bag for challenging behavior, put in the plywood box, and put in the padded room. And you know, and I'm seeing this and seeing that this is a little bit of a trend, and it all, for me, and maybe I'm oversimplifying it, seems like there are people who don't know what they're doing.
Well, that would be my interpretation too.
Okay, so it's not just me.
No, not just you.
Okay.
We could both be wrong, but I doubt it. Yeah,
I doubt that.
Usually these circumstances come down to inadequate training, and inadequate professional supervision and high quality training. You know, I think it's important for your viewers too to hear some distinctions made between sort of some of these different procedures that we're hearing about. So for scream room, if it's being done to sort of calm the kid down, that's one thing. I'm pretty positive there's zero research to suggest that will actually treat challenging behavior. Letting a kid calm down as a consequence of the problem behavior, there's no research to suggest that will help them not do that behavior again in the future. Okay.
And wouldn't it be more effective to try to find something to intervene before the kid got upset?
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's what we talk about as antecedent-based intervention components, where you're doing something to prevent the problem behavior. So you're teaching the kid an alternative form of communication to get what they want. So this whole calming down idea, I don't know if your child's treatment team is doing this, again, take some data and see, is it actually working?
Right.
If the calming down thing is reducing the rate of those behaviors over time, great. Even though there's no research, I'm not necessarily going to, argue against it.
Okay.
But if it's not, right, so if you see the rate of your child's challenging behavior stay about the same, even though they're calming down every time they do it, that means it's not working and it's time to do something else.
A lot of times, though, the schools aren't taking data. We want them to be taking data, but a lot of times they're not.
Yeah, and if they're placing your child in a more restrictive placement or threatening to kick them out of school, they have to, by federal law, collect data on your child's behavior.
Okay.
And they need to be accountable for that.
Okay, so let's look at this from both sides of the equation. If you were a teacher, and you've got a kid in a classroom and you don't have any training in autism or behavior modification, ABA, you don't know what you're doing, but you've been put into a classroom, you want to hang on to your job, you want your classroom to function properly. What kinds of things can you do to educate yourself? Because we know that the schools are, not necessarily going to present, we hope, soon they're going to present you with a training, but if you're a teacher and you want to, because we have wonderful teachers who watch this show and write in and say, I want to be better, and aides who say, I want to be better. I always say CARD learning is a great place to start.
That's a good place to start.
Because you'll learn about looking at behavior in a way that I think you probably haven't before. But what else would you recommend as a professional?
A great place to start is to go to the website for the Association for Behavior Analysis International, which is the major professional association for ABA folks. And they have conferences. They have one major conference over Memorial Day weekend, next weekend, every year. And at that conference, it's in a different U.S. city every year, but at that conference, there's probably, 100 or so different workshops that you can take that give you practical training on how to deal with a very large variety of situations, and challenging behavior is a real common topic. So that conference is once a year. That's a wealth of information, both for the workshops, but also you can go and view presentations, on new ways of treating challenging behaviors. But also there's regional chapters. So ABAI is the national, or actually international, professional association, but they have regional chapters all over the place. So there's probably, I'm just guessing, maybe 20 or 30 different regional chapters of that same organization across the United States. And so chances are there will be a regional conference once a year within, 5-hour drive or so of wherever you live, where you can go and get the same type of training there too. So there's all these, so there's California ABA, there's Midwest ABA, there's Massachusetts ABA, there's Florida ABA. And pretty much anywhere you go, there'll be these local conferences. Each one of those conferences also has seminars that and workshops for professionals. And so those are, and usually they're very affordably priced, and you can attend maybe a 3 or 6 hour training. So that's a whole wealth of information too.
Okay, and we should say you're going to be at the conference next week. Are you presenting?
Yeah.
You know your topic already?
Yeah. Actually, I'm geeking it out this year. I'm presenting 2 different presentations on sort of analyzing the philosophical foundations of behavior science. So dealing with real basic issues like what is behavior, what is functional relation between behavior and environment, what's the nature of what we do in our science, and what topics are valuable and what should we be studying, sort of future directions for our science in general. So actually nothing to do with autism in particular.
Interesting.
But just more general science stuff.
But I'm also going to be there. We're taking the show on the road, so we're going to meet with some people and interview some people and get you the lowdown about what's happening there that we'll report back to you in that week afterwards. But so now, and I would imagine that most schools now in the United States either have a psychologist or a psychiatrist or a BCBA on staff. Right? I mean, they're supposed to.
Wrong.
No, I mean, I say that all the time, that everybody has somebody. They don't?
There's always somebody, but I wouldn't necessarily say it's a BCBA. I would say the vast majority of schools probably still do not have a BCBA. Maybe have not even heard of a BCBA, potentially still. It's scary but true. There will be a school psychologist or a school counselor or somebody
who can do a functional behavior assessment.
There will be someone who, in their job description, they're supposed to be able to do a functional behavioral assessment. There's a decent chance, depending on where you live, that who you have in your school district or at your school doesn't really know how to do it. They don't really have proper training. They've maybe taken one seminar, or they've read one manual or something like that. So that can be challenging.
Well, I would at least, as a teacher, be finding out who is the person. When I was teaching, I was always, who is the person that can help me with challenging behaviors that I can run things by. And maybe you'll find out the best of all possible worlds, that that you have a BCBA who actually has some training with autism if you've got a child with autism in the classroom. Let's talk about on the flip side, though, for the parents.
Sure.
So you're a parent and you're getting notes coming home from school saying, you know, Johnny is not behaving, and you know, Suzette is being put in the screen room, and you know, Beth is doing this, and we're going to change the placement. You know, what kinds of things can we be doing and asking for? We ask them what the data is.
Yeah, here's sort of a general tip, and I kind of feel like I'm always bad-mouthing the American education system when I'm on your show, and I certainly don't need to be.
And I think people know where I come from, too, that I think 99% of the people who work in the education system mean well.
Yeah,
They're there because they want to be. But if they don't have the tools, they don't have the tools. How, you know, if I were going to have to fix your car, and I you know, and I haven't had the training, and I don't have a screwdriver that's going to do it, how good of a job am I going to do? I can be very well-intentioned.
Right.
So, and I think teachers who are really good and on it, they know, and they're looking for answers.
I think, unfortunately, your mechanic analogy is good because a lot of American education is in a situation where there aren't any other mechanics that do know how to fix the cars, so they're the only ones that deal with the car. And you kind of get the car and it still doesn't work, or it's being fixed improperly, or you know, and it's, I mean, you can't really blame them. Like you said, they don't have the training, and there isn't another mechanic standing by to do it for them. So what I was going to say was sort of the major general, you know, picture that we get from parents all the time, and there are exceptions to this, but I would say this is probably the rule, is you got to just demand. You got to be pushy, and you got to be demanding, and you have to stand up for your kid getting the best quality possible treatment, the least restrictive placements, and the best quality opportunities. And if you don't demand that, you're not going to get the best. And that usually is how it works. And that's unfortunate. And, you know, and again, the school district folks are not bad guys. There's a limited amount of resources. They don't have time to do everything they need to do. They don't have the money or the funding to provide every child with the services they should probably be getting. And they probably don't have the training. So, you know, what are they going to do? Of course, they're going to give the squeaky wheel the grease.
And we do need to do that. We need to be the advocates for our kids. It's unfortunate. You know, early on, we had such guilt because we would fight for things, and from time to time when we didn't have a tape recorder going, somebody would say, well, there was one person in particular who said, well, because we've paid for an aid for your son in preschool, this school is not going to be able to afford computers and books for the next 5 years. Yes, she literally, and I said, you know, I want you to stop for a second and consider what you just said to me, because that's not my problem. And I said, I didn't birth the rest of these children. I didn't bring them into the world. And so that's not my problem. That's your problem. My problem is this child. I brought him into the world, and he's my responsibility. So don't try to make me feel bad for showing up for him. And then, of course, I went home and cried and thought about all the computers for the other kids and had that guilt.
Well, yeah,
and said,
you're going to have that guilt, but that can't change you from doing what you need to do for your child. Period. So, you have to be demanding. For our kids. So the first thing is, show me the data. I want to see the data. How often is my kid doing that behavior? This particular behavior that is supposedly ruining the whole classroom and making my child get a more restrictive placement, let me see the data. I want to know how often it's happening. I want to know under what conditions it's happening, and who's collecting the data, and how do we know those data are really accurate. And then I want to see a functional behavioral assessment, you know, and I want to see that it's done by someone who's an expert and who has experience doing it. And then I want to see the behavior intervention plan. And I want to see somebody execute it. That's right. Do they know how to do it? And the behavior intervention plan needs to be related to the function of the behavior. What we see all the time is an FBA is done, but then just sort of a standard behavior intervention plan is applied that actually doesn't even reference the function of the behavior. And so it's just kind of, well, this is what we do for all kids who are a pain in the rear, and it seems to work, so we'll try that, you know. Cookie cutter. Yeah, cookie cutter, exactly. So very frustrating. Okay, we should take a break, but when we come back, we'll talk about this, and I want to talk a little bit about the idea of restraint, too, and the history of restraints and what works and what doesn't work. So stick with us, more with Dr. Jonathan Tarbox when we come back.
Welcome back to Autism Live. I'm busy talking here with Dr. Jonathan Tarbox and having a wonderful time. We've been talking about timeouts and when timeouts are effective with all these different stories that we're hearing about in the news with scream rooms and plywood boxes and cardboard boxes. It can be very confusing for parents. But we've been talking about things you can do if you're a parent to educate yourself and to advocate for your child, things you can do if you're a teacher, conferences that you can attend. But you brought up the question of restraints. Right. And how do we restrain a child and what's appropriate and what isn't? And I think this is where I feel like we step on the edge of the cliff because this is scary land for me.
It is, yeah. And you know, and it's important to distinguish between a couple more terms too.
Okay.
Punishment and abuse are not the same thing. Punishment is a consequence of behavior that will hopefully decrease the rate of behavior, but if you're doing it as treatment, it needs to be ethically justified, okay? And for example, let's say you were my employee and you came in late to work and I looked you in the eye and I said, honestly, don't do that anymore. Please stop coming into work. If you stopped coming into work, that would have been punishment. It was a consequence of your behavior, it decreased behavior, okay? So it totally depends on the person, depends on the behavior, and it doesn't necessarily mean anything mean that you're doing. It just means a consequence that effectively helps the person decrease the behavior. So that's not the same thing as abuse. Zipping someone up in a duffel bag, putting a child in the duffel bag or a plywood box is called child abuse. I mean, we don't need, that's not what we're talking about here at all. Frankly, a lot of this cardboard box stuff sounds like it's bordering on abuse too. Locking kids up in a closet, a broom closet, cardboard boxes, things like that. That's child abuse. That's not behavior modification. That's not ABA. That's not a BIP. It's not even an emergency procedure. It's crazy, right? It's
well, I think the parents are all in agreement with you. Unfortunately, certainly the teachers are not all in agreement that have been doing this, and even some of the school districts are not coming out and saying clearly this is inappropriate. They're kind of, because it's all a legal issue, they're kind of skating around it and saying, well, we're looking into, what our policies are on X, Y, and Z. So it makes it kind of tough. But even for parents, there comes a time, I mentioned that we had one person write into our question of the day and said, my child is getting bigger and I can't control, and he has anger issues, and I'm, this person was saying, I don't want to medicate him, but I fear that I'll have to for his well-being and for our well-being. And other people are at home and dealing with a situation with a child who's violent and getting bigger and not knowing how to restrain in the moment what's happening and what's down the pike for them when the child gets bigger. I know we went through a period where Jem cycled twice. He cycled in and out of hitting me. He wasn't hitting everybody, was hitting me. And I can remember one occasion where they called you in. You and Art came to the clinic room because I said, that's it, guys. I'm right here. Something bad's going to happen because I was in tears and saying, somebody help me. I'm, going south. I can't be hit in the head anymore. I can't. I couldn't take it much more. And you guys came in and talked to me about how I could, without hurting him in the moment, block, defend myself, and make it so that he couldn't hit me. Everybody doesn't have the benefit of that, but of you guys coming in and showing with different things with their individual child at different ages. But what can you tell us about restraining, whether it's at school or at home?
Restraint is a big topic, and like you said, kind of a big, scary, edge of the cliff type topic.
Really is.
It's very serious business. A significant number of people have been killed by putting them in restraint inappropriately and unprofessionally.
We just saw this week, in fact, not for a kid who was on the spectrum, but a kid who had challenging behaviors in a school at a basketball game, and the school is saying that everybody was trained in appropriate restraints, but the child died. They're saying that there might have been a heart issue with the child, but 6 people were restraining him and he died as a result.
So I'm not familiar with that particular case, obviously, it's brand new, but generally speaking, if manual restraint is implemented properly and correctly, people don't die. They shouldn't even get hurt. I mean, if the person is really completely out of control, they might get a scrape or a bruise or something like that. But you don't die when you're in professionally, properly implemented manual restraint. Luckily, we don't see a lot of manual restraint anymore because positive reinforcement-based behavior intervention procedures are so powerful and so effective that we very rarely need to resort to restraint.
That's an important thing to say.
Very
that if we're doing the right things, it's not necessary.
Right. And there's an important distinction to be made between mechanical restraint, which is where you use some object or some device to restrain the person, versus manual restraint, where you're simply holding them to restrain them. Mechanical restraints aren't used very much anymore, but they used to be things like straitjackets, handcuffs, where you'd cuff to a belt around the person's waist, or they would, strap someone to a gurney, that kind of thing. We don't see a lot of that anymore. Manual restraints, there's a variety of different procedures. There's different certification programs that you can go through. One of them is called PART, another one is called CPI, and these programs teach you ways that they think are safe to manually restrain people. I'm not sure if any of those different programs really have it all right or not. But I have used manual restraint before under careful supervision by people who were experts in it. And it has been very effective, but it's not something I would ever jump to before trying lots and lots and lots of other positive reinforcement-based procedures. Generally speaking, it only needs to be done as an emergency intervention, only if someone's actually going to get hurt. The danger with restraint is it can be something that the caregiver, a parent or a teacher or an aide does because they want to, almost because they're angry at the kid for misbehaving, and so it's a way almost for the caregiver to express their anger, and so that becomes a very dangerous slippery slope that you don't want to go down. If manual restraint is ever implemented, it's because someone's in danger of getting hurt, not because the caregiver is mad. If you're feeling emotions of anger, that's not the right time to implement manual restraint. That's when someone can get hurt.
I have to add just a little disclaimer that when you guys came and showed me how to block and how to protect myself, it was at the same time that we were also instituting a big behavior intervention plan at home. So literally, I think it ended up coming up once when, because what we were doing, the changes that we made it so that we weren't getting to that point, that he wasn't hitting me. So I definitely wanted to add that in, that it wasn't just that you guys came and showed me,
Great.
You're right.
Thank you.
Right? Okay. But in any case, so back to what you were saying about restraint.
And it is worth mentioning that the treatment research on manual restraint shows pretty clearly that it can be actually a very effective behavioral intervention procedure for severe behavior when done safely and professionally and properly. So, you see some movements of people saying something like no manual restraint ever under any circumstances. But, I've worked with people who were literally blind in one eye from punching themselves in the eye. So what's more ethical? Let someone blind themselves just so you don't physically withhold their movement? I mean, so it's not a black and white issue. For 90% of your listeners, their kids or family members are not engaging in behavior that's severe enough to justify manual restraint. But in really severe cases where someone's going to get hurt, and you have tried plenty of positive reinforcement-based interventions first, it's probably more ethically justified to move to something more intrusive that will prevent injury from happening than it is to just keep doing the same ineffective thing over and over and letting people get hurt. But it needs to be done by someone who has experience doing it. It needs to be very carefully supervised, and it needs to be, if it's ever done, manual restraint needs to be implemented at the same time as a ton of positive reinforcement for alternative behaviors. So.
Really, it's stuff that my chest starts to feel tight when we talk about all this stuff, because having been in a place where I felt that desperation, and we had at least 2 people write in today that I feel like are in that desperate place. What advice do you give to people about, if they're in a place today? I asked, what's been your worst day since you were diagnosed? And there were several people who wrote in and said today. Today is it. And it just, I feel for them. What would you recommend for people who are in a place where the challenging behavior is so overwhelming? We had one person who wrote in and said that their child has been tantruming for 7 days, nonstop, and the person said, and I now have a migraine that has been lasting for several days when I never had a migraine last for more than 24 hours, and I'm thinking, well, but if your child's tantruming for 7 days,
it's something else. else. Yeah. Well, the first thing that I always like to remind folks of is challenging behavior is common in individuals with autism, but it's not part of autism. You don't have to have challenging behavior just because you have autism.
Right.
All challenging behaviors are treatable in individuals with autism. So if your child's having tantrums for 7 days straight, that's treatable, and that can be fixed.
Yeah.
That absolutely can be fixed. But there's really only, honestly, really only one major approach to treating challenging behavior that's been proven to work by literally hundreds of research studies, and that's applied behavior analysis.
Okay.
Positive behavior supports is one type of applied behavior analysis, but applied behavior analysis is the treatment of choice. And so if you have a family member with a significant amount of challenging behavior, you need to get yourself a professional behavior analyst, someone who has years of experience and who's an expert in treating challenging behavior. It can't just be a teacher who took one seminar, or it can't just be you on your own buying some books off the internet and watching TV or something. That's it's not enough.
You need more help than that.
You need more help. You need someone who's an expert, and it needs to be a master's or PhD level behavior analyst, ideally a board certified behavior analyst or BCBA. And it's going to take some time, and it's going to take some intensive work, but it is treatable. It doesn't need to just keep happening.
And not only just a BCBA, but a BCBA who has experience with autism and with this, whatever the challenging behavior is, right?
That's right, yeah.
I think there is an emotional thing about accepting that you can't do it by yourself.
Absolutely.
But I haven't met anybody who could do it by themselves, so that you got to take some help. You got to, you know, I know, you know, it's a feeling. I always used to say, I'm trying really hard to do this all on my own. I want to be autism super mom. I got the cape and everything, but it keeps getting caught in the fan. Not working for me. You know, we can't do it by ourselves. We can't. And I think that's the first step, is accepting, all right, this is out of control. And the second step, realizing I can get some help, but you got to ask for it.
Yeah, you got to ask for it.
And there are plenty of people who can help you. I mentioned SOS. That's a great place to start.
You can also go to, you know, if our SOS services here for whatever reason can't help you, if they're too long of a wait list, or we don't go to your area, or whatever it is, you can also go to the Behavior Analyst Certification Board's website, bacb.com, and click on the link. I believe it says for consumers, and it's a certificate registry. And so you can look up by state, maybe even by zip code, all the BCBAs in your area, and then you can contact them through the website. So there's no reason to go, you know, to try to go it alone. There is help out there.
Awesome. Thank you. This is a wealth of information for people. I've learned some stuff here that I know I'm going to be talking about more on the show. So thank you so much.
Happy to be here.
We're not going to be here with you next Friday or the Friday after, so it's going to be 3 weeks before we see you again on the show, but we'll look forward to that. And in the meantime, though, if you have questions for Dr. Tarbox about any of the things that he said here today, you can write to us and we will get those questions to him. And you still are running a survey on Autism Research Group?
That's correct. Yeah, we're running 2 different surveys, actually. One is for a parent training grant that we're writing, and we want to make sure that the grant actually addresses topics that matter to parents. So it's a brief survey. It won't take more than 5 minutes. So I highly encourage readers to please go to autismresearchgroup.org, and there's 2 different surveys on the homepage. Click on the links and take the survey. Tell us, parents should tell us what you want done in our research for autism. It's
a wonderful opportunity to really be heard, because they are reading your emails and reading the surveys. So a great thing. Thank you so much for all that you do, and we'll look forward to seeing you back on the show in 3 weeks.